Hello everyone and welcome back to the CyberRanger's CVEs Uncovered video series. This is a gripping video series that will take you on a journey through the heart of cybersecurity's biggest challenges. Join us today as we delve deep into the world of Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, also known as CVEs, and reveal the stories behind the most severe security breaches of our time. In this episode, we will be taking a closer look at the Log4Shell vulnerability that was publicly disclosed in 2021. Log4Shell received widespread attention and concern from the cybersecurity community and organizations worldwide because it affected the Apache Log4j library, which is a widely utilized Java-based logging framework that is used in many applications and services. The name Log4Shell was derived from the combination of Log4j, which was the affected library, and shell, a reference to the ability to execute arbitrary commands on a compromised system. The vulnerability allows remote attackers to execute arbitrary code on a target system, potentially leading to unauthorized access, data breaches, and system compromise. It primarily relies on a flaw in how Log4j processes certain log messages, allowing an attacker to inject malicious code that can then be executed when the Log4j library processes the log message. In response to the Log4Shell vulnerability, many organizations and system administrators took immediate action to patch the affected systems and update the Log4j library to a more secure version. It also prompted software developers and maintainers to conduct security reviews of their applications and libraries to identify and remediate any potential packages or software affected by the Log4Shell vulnerability. In this video, we're going to be taking a closer look at what causes the vulnerability and how the vulnerability can be exploited in detail. But more than that, we're going to be providing you with free access to the lab that we will be utilizing in this video on the CyberRanger's platform so that you can exploit the vulnerability for yourself. In order to access the lab, please take a look at the link in the description to get yourself registered on the CyberRanger's platform so that you can access the lab for free. With that being said, let's get started with today's episode, and I'll be seeing you in the technical analysis section of this video. Alright, so to kick things off, we firstly need to get an understanding as to what causes the Log4Shell vulnerability, and furthermore, or in addition to that, we also need to get an understanding as to how the vulnerability can be exploited or how it is frequently exploited by attackers. So to get started, what is Log4Shell, or really where did it come from? So let's take a look at exactly where it all began or where it all started. So it all started on November the 30th, 2021. So the Apache Log4j development team was made aware of a vulnerability in Log4j that could allow injection of malicious input that could consequently facilitate remote code execution. On December the 9th, 2021, the InfoSec community was made aware of this finding and the far-reaching impacts of the vulnerability. So the vulnerability could potentially allow attackers to take control of any system or any piece of software and the underlying system running Log4j for the purposes of logging by logging a certain string. The vulnerability, now assigned as CVE-2021-44228, has a severity score of 10, really 9, which is still critical and has been dubbed Log4Shell. So that begs the question, what is Log4j? Because it's arguably, or it really is the core of the vulnerability in terms of what is affected. And the key thing to note is that Log4j is a very minute piece of software that does really only one thing, and that is logging. However, the reason for the severity of the vulnerability came down to the fact that a lot of websites, applications, programs, and games like Minecraft all utilized Log4j as part of the larger software package. So Apache Log4j is one of the most widely utilized open source Java-based logging utilities. It is utilized by various Apache solutions like Apache Tomcat, Apache Solr, and Apache Druid, to name a few. Many third-party applications and vendors like Twitter, Apple, Steam, and even Minecraft utilize Log4j for logging. And more information about the actual Log4j attack surface can be found on the GitHub repository linked to this slide, more of which we'll actually be exploring. So Log4j version 2.16.0 was released in order to patch this vulnerability, and the primary remediation or mitigation strategy that was recommended was to either disable Log4j as a whole or to update to the new version, which was 2.16.0. If we take a closer look at the Log4Shell severity on CVE details here, you can see that the CVSS score was 9.3, and the CIA triad in terms of the impact, which stands for the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad, you can see that they are pretty much complete, which means that there is total information disclosure, there is total compromise of system integrity, and there is a total shutdown of the affected resource. If we take a look at the access complexity, that is set to medium, and the access conditions are somewhat specialized, which is exactly what we'll be taking a look at shortly once we have this technical overview of the vulnerability. And more importantly, the vulnerability type is, of course, execution of code or remote code execution. So we're dealing with a vulnerability that is quite severe in terms of its impact. So how does Log4j work in terms of its primary functionality? So based on what I've already told you, Log4j is a package that is used for logging in Java-based web applications, right? So not really Java-based web applications per se, but any Java-based application. So Log4j appends additional logic to logs by parsing entries, and in some cases the entries could be evaluated or executed just as they're entered into log files. So the key thing to note here is that Log4j is used for logging, and when it does this, it also has the ability to append additional logic to specific logs being logged, right? And it does this by parsing entries. And in certain cases, based on the functionality of the application or web application, if certain logic, potentially malicious logic, was included or parsed with the log, these entries could be evaluated or executed as they are being entered into log files. So Log4j essentially utilizes the following syntax, where you have the prefix and the name, key pair or pair for various lookups. This is an example of the logic that you'll typically see being appended to specific logs. And in this case, the prefix right over here, or the parameter name in this particular pair, so you have the prefix and then the name. In this particular case, name will require evaluation. So that means that anything parsed in as a value of name will be evaluated by Log4j. So for an example of this is Java version, right, which would obviously display the version of Java. So log messages and parameters do not protect against attacker-controlled LDAP and other JNDI-related endpoints. And this is where the whole vulnerability really starts to take shape in terms of its exploitation. So the key thing to note here is that log messages and parameters do not have any protection against communication coming from attacker-controlled LDAP and other JNDI-related endpoints. So that brings us to a very important point, and that is, what is JNDI? So JNDI stands for the Java Naming and Directory Interface, right? And it provides Java-based applications with an API endpoint that can be used to interact with services like LDAP, which is the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, to access external resources. And Apache Log4j versions 2.0 beta 9 through 2.12.1 and 2.13.0 through 2.15.0 utilize and come pre-packaged with a JNDI lookup plugin. All right, so That means an attacker could potentially invoke Log4j to utilize the JNDI lookup plugin to try and load in an external resource from an LDAP server. And if we actually direct Log4j or essentially invoke it to perform a lookup on an attacker controlled LDAP server, then we can do something malicious. So an attacker could potentially utilize the JNDI plugin in conjunction with a malicious LDAP attacker controlled LDAP referral server to instantiate a malicious Java class. An LDAP referral server provides a reference to an alternate location in which the or an LDAP request may be processed. So you'll actually see how this will play out. So in essence, what we need fundamentally to get this to work is we need to be able to set up a malicious, or rather an LDAP referral server, which we'll actually be taking a look at how to do, and then getting or inputting the following payload, at least this is the syntax of the payload, into an application input. So we're trying to find an application input or an input on the application that is being logged by Log4j. So the following payload invokes the JNDI plugin to interact with the attacker controlled LDAP referral server. So in essence, all an attacker has to do is identify an application input that is being logged by Log4j and then inject the payload into that input. So it's very, you can think of this as a partial injection vulnerability in terms of the access or input vector. And the LDAP referral server will then provide a reference to an attacker controlled web server, which we'll also need to set up. And the attacker controlled web server will essentially be hosting the malicious Java class, or the Java class that we want executed on the actual target server that is running the Java based application or the Java application. So the following payload can be injected into the following locations. So, a very good point of input is an API endpoint. Login forms are very common, and HTTP headers. Now, this is not an extensive list of, potential input vectors or attack vectors in terms of where you can inject this payload, but these are the most common. All right, so now that we have a somewhat of a good understanding, or at least I would say a brief understanding of what exactly is going on, we can best contextualize this by actually taking a look at how to identify and exploit the vulnerability through the use of a live lab. And as mentioned earlier on, you can access this lab for free on CyberRanges by registering for an account. This can be done by navigating to app.cyberranges.com, of which you'll actually see the URL displayed on your screen right now. You'll also find the instructions in the description section. Once you do that, I'll be walking you through the process of accessing the lab in the next section. So with that being said, let me switch over and we'll take a look at the lab, how to access it, and of course the practical demonstration of how to identify and exploit the vulnerability. All right, before we actually get started with the practical demo, I'm going to be walking you through how to register for an account on CyberRanges and how to get access to the Log4Shell lab. It really is very simple. However, if this is your first time utilizing or hearing about CyberRanges, you might be a little bit confused as to what CyberRanges is. CyberRanges in this context is an online virtual cyberrange, arguably one of the best out there. And CyberRanges, in essence, or in cybersecurity parlance, can be thought of as an online platform that provides you with virtual cybersecurity labs, but much more realistic and complex. So the training or the labs are built around experiential training, or essentially provide you with an experiential experience, and also have threat-informed simulation-based labs. However, that's sort of getting ahead of myself. In order to get started, what you want to do is navigate to app.cyberranges.com, the link to which is actually in the description section. And given that this is your first time, you'll be directed to a page sort of similar to what you're seeing here. And if you don't have an account already, you just need to click on register, where you will need to provide a unique username and a valid email, as you will be sent a verification email. You do not need to put in a promo code just click on I have read and agree to the terms and conditions. You can actually go through the terms and conditions, and that's pretty much it. Once you have successfully completed this registration form, you will receive a confirmation email to the email you provided here. So again, ensure that the email is legitimate. And once that is done, once you click on the verification email, you'll then be prompted to provide your password. And once that is done, you are then good to go in terms of logging in. So I already have an account, so I'm just going to sign in by just providing my credentials here. And I'm going to log in like so, and you'll be logged into the CyberRanges platform. From this point on, it's very, very simple to access the Log4Shell lab. Before we do that, on the sidebar here, labs are sorted into playlists, and scenarios are just the word or nomenclature used to refer to a lab. So scenarios are in essence individual labs, whereas playlists are a collection of labs designed to teach you a particular skill. You'll have free access to the community labs right over here. So if you click on the community section, you're going to see a set of playlists. Again, playlists are just collections of scenarios, and scenarios can be thought of as labs. So the Log4Shell lab is accessible right over here under CVE labs. So you just click on that, and you should already have access to it. So these should be free. And you'll be able to see the Log4Shell lab right over here. So that's Log4Shell CVE-2021-44228 Tomcat exploitation. And pretty much once you're good to go, just click on start, and that'll bring you to the actual lab page. And from this point on, you can just click on start. And once you do, the lab is going to initiate. And on this particular screen, you're going to see the walkthrough that I developed for this lab, that essentially dives deeper into how the vulnerability works and how to exploit the vulnerability, but it's in a textual format. I'll also be walking you through this once we've completed this. So the lab will take a couple of seconds to a minute to start up, and you'll be provided with your own Kali Linux system. So once the lab is good to go, you'll then be directed to the lab page. So I'm going to wait for this to load up, and we'll pick it up from there. All right, so now that we've got an understanding as to what the Log4Shell vulnerability is, what causes it, and how it can be exploited, let's take a look at how to actually exploit the vulnerability. And in this case, we'll be targeting a web application that is being hosted on an Apache Tomcat web server. So I'm currently on the scenario mission page, where I've sort of gone over what we've already covered in the slides. So you can go through this as well, just in case you need a reference. And in addition to that, I've also added the exploitation procedures section here, which sort of outlines the steps that we will be performing to facilitate the exploit. Now, if we take a look at the service page, you will be provided with a Kali Linux system that has everything configured. So the proof of concept exploit code is already on there. And I've already set up the Java environment so that you can compile the necessary Java files in order to actually facilitate the exploit. So you can access this system via RDP within your browser, so you don't need the VPN access. Alternatively, if you do want to utilize or go through this scenario with your own Kali Linux system or attack box, you can connect to the CyberRanges VPN and target the Apache Tomcat server independently. So again, the Kali box is there for you if you don't want to go through the process of setting up your environment. All right, so we can access the web application directly from your browser. So, in that case, it's fairly simple. You can open it up, and you will be passed through a proxy. So you can see right over here, that's the proxy, and this is the web application we'll be targeting. So this web app is a Java web application that is being hosted on an Apache Tomcat web server that utilizes the Log4j logging services. And you can see it directs you to a page called Go Finance, and a login form is displayed here, which is very interesting. We might be able to target that as our attack vector. So if we take a look at the actual mission here, which is under overview, you can see we have the mission. I've already outlined the various steps that we'll be following. So if we go into the Kali Linux system here, and the first step that we'll need to perform is to perform an Nmap scan on the target server, whose IP address has already been displayed under the servers tab here. So these are static IPs. In this case, the Apache Tomcat server is 192.168 .125.200. So what I'm going to do now is just say sudo, and in this particular case, I already have that command in my history. So we'll just perform a quick service version detection scan just to verify that this target server is indeed running an Apache Tomcat server on port 8080. So the password for the Kali user is just password, all in lowercase. That information is also highlighted here. So under the lab access guidelines, you can see the credentials for the Kali system in the event that you'll be prompted for a password. So the Nmap scan should reveal that we only have 2 ports on the target system, one of which will be an SSH port, or the SSH port itself. So you can see port 22 SSH, and the service that's running is OpenSSH, and we have on port 8080 the Apache Tomcat web server. So if we open up our browser really quickly, in this case it's Firefox, we can just open up the target IP, or the web server on the target IP. So that's on port 8080. That'll redirect you to the Apache Tomcat dashboard. Now the target vulnerable web application is hosted under a directory called Log4Shell. So just as a side note, if you are accessing this URL or you're trying to access the web application from within the Kali Linux system, you might have issues with the web page being displayed correctly. However, the web page is still, or the web application is still functioning as it should. So we'll just give this a couple of seconds. It might not load the various style sheets used. In that case, you can always revert to using the actual URL that is being passed through the proxy. However, as I said, we'll not really be dealing with the web application. We're primarily going to be focused on injecting our payload into an input form. And in this case, it's going to be most probably the login form. So we'll give this a couple of seconds. If we just terminate the loading, you can see it still works. And at the bottom here, we should have the login page right over here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to verify that this Apache Tomcat web server does have the Apache Log4j logging services enabled. The best way we can do this is to quickly set up a netcat listener. It can be on any port. In this case, I'll just use port 1234 as an example. And we can then open up another terminal. So what I'll do here is, let me just see if we can open up a new tab. And I think that'll be displayed much better. So I'll say File, New Tab, and then I'll just increase the font size here. If we take a look at the web application itself, you can see that we have the ability to log in. And with this particular web application, we have the ability to pass in, parameters and values. So if we try and log in with, test and test, no matter whether you do this from your browser or from your Kali Linux system, you can see that it tells us that the password we entered was invalid, and we can see we have the login page here. And what we can do is sort of use that. So if I say Log4Shell, login, and we can then say the parameter in this particular case can be CMD, for example. And, we can then pass in a value. In this case, to test this out, we can utilize the JNDI LDAP payload and tell it to connect to our netcat listener on the Kali Linux system. All right. So hopefully that makes sense. And, we can do it from the Kali Linux system itself. So again, the same thing, can happen here. So if I say log in, we can say login, command equals, etc. And we can also do this with a tool like curl. So the JNDI LDAP payload that we'll be using to test this is as follows. We essentially pass in the following payload. We specify the attacker control LDAP server. In this case, we have not set it up yet, so we're just specifying the Kali IP address and the port of the that the netcat listener is listing on. So just again, to do this, what we're going to do now is just say curl. So I'll go back into my Kali box here, and we will say curl. And I already have the command there. So I'll just say HTTP, and I'll just highlight what we're doing. So we're saying 192.168.125.200 port 8080 Log4Shell login CMD equals, and then we pass in that particular JNDI LDAP payload. However, what we are going to do here is we are not going to specify the name of the Java class that we want to instantiate. Instead, we're going to put in the port of the that netcat is running on the Kali Linux system. And what we'll do now is just make sure that the syntax is all good. And if we hit enter, which I'll do right now, and we take a look at our netcat listener, you can see we get a connection back. What that means is that any login entries or any login requests are being logged by Apache Log4j, and because we injected the payload, we know that this entry was actually parsed and executed. So Log4j actually said, okay, you're telling me to connect to the following LDAP referral server or the LDAP server. And in this case, it connects. However, we don't have an LDAP referral server, so it just connects to the netcat listener. In this case, the netcat listener receives a connection, which means it is indeed working. And that means that we can proceed with the exploit. So what I'll do now is we can keep this terminal open. So I'll just clear that terminal out there. And if we go back to our web browser, we can actually begin with the exploit itself. And the first step that we need to perform is to actually take a look at the exploit itself, the reverse shell exploit that we'll be using. So on your desktop, you will have a folder called Log4j POC. And in here, we have the exploit, the Java exploit. This is a simple Java reverse shell. So you can see that it's already been set to connect, or the IP address here, the variable host, is set to the Kali Linux IP. So you don't need to change that. And then the port is set to 9999. So in your case, unless you're working with your own Kali box, you don't need to modify this. You can just leave it as is. So the first step again will be to compile that. So I'm just going to switch back over into my terminal, and we'll navigate into my desktop and into Log4j POC. And we now need to compile the exploit. And there's something that you need to take into consideration here. Now, whenever you're compiling a Java class, you need to ensure that you're compiling it for the specific version that this class is going to be executed on. So that means if the target web server is running Java 8, you need to compile this this particular Java exploit into a Java 8 class. So in this case, we already know that this target web server is running Java 8. However, this will require some trial and error in the wild. So we'll use the Java compile utility, and we'll just say exploit.java. The source is set to 8 and the target is set to 8. So source is Java 8, the target is also Java 8. We hit enter, and now you'll be provided with a exploit.class file. So that's the exploit that will be instantiated or executed on the Apache Tomcat web server by the Log4j logging services. All right, so now that that is done, we're going to be utilizing multiple tabs. We can now set up our LDAP referral server. So we're going to be utilizing the really cool LDAP referral server set up by MarshallSec. So all credit to him. A link to the GitHub repo will be put in the scenario mission, so you can actually follow along with this. So we can essentially say Java CP, and we want to navigate to, in this particular case, target, and the actual jar file that we want to execute is MarshallSec 0.0.3 snapshot all.jar, and in this particular case we are then going to specify the address, so Marshall, or rather the domain. So this has to be as I'm typing it in, so MarshallSec.jndi, and in this particular case it's going to be LDAP referral server, and then we need to put in, so I'm going to say HTTP. We need to put in our Kali Linux IP. So 192, let me make sure I'm typing that in correctly. 192.168.125.100. And then the port, in this case, we're just going to say is port 8080. So port 8080, and we are then going to say / and then we specify the name of the resource. In this case, because we named the Java class exploit, we're just going to say exploit. We don't need to provide the extension name. And then what we need to do now is just hit enter. We hit enter, and you can see that's going to set up the LDAP referral server on port 1389. What this means is that when we specify this address here, this means that the LDAP referral server will forward all requests to the Kali Linux IP on port 8080. So that's the web server. The web server is going to be running on port 8080. You can configure that to run on whatever port you want. And that web server is going to be hosting the Java exploit, or the exploit class, if you will, All right, so that's the first tab or the first window that we want to keep open. The second window will navigate to desktop log4j POC. So navigate to the directory where you have the exploit.class file. And in this particular case, we will say, we'll actually just use a Python module to set up the HTTP web server. So I'll say Python 3 module HTTP server, http.server, and then port 8080. So there we are. We have a web server that is running on port 8080 and it's hosting all the files within this directory. So the most important thing is that you're hosting the exploit.class file. All right, so now that that is done, we can now move on to the next step, which will involve setting up our netcat listener based on the port you had specified in the actual Java exploit code. So remember, it was set up to be 9999 as follows here. So that's going to listen for any connection. And then finally, we'll open up a new tab. And in this one, we can now make the request with curl. So I'm going to say curl. And in this particular case, we can utilize the history here, but let me explain what's happening. So we're essentially saying we're making a request to the web application. So that's Log4Shell. We're then passing in the JNDI LDAP payload, which is then connecting to the LDAP referral server on the Kali Linux system that is running on port 1389. And that is looking for the resource called exploit, which is then hosted consequently on a web server that we control. So if we hit enter, if we take a look at all the windows here, starting from the LDAP referral server, you can see that once we hit enter, an LDAP reference result for the exploit will redirect to the following URL. If we take a look at the web server, we can see that a GET request was made for exploit.class, and that was successful, which means it was successfully downloaded or saved or processed, for lack of a better word, by Log4j. And right over here on our netcat listener, we get a connection, and this is indeed a reverse shell connection. So if I type in ls, you can see that we have a reverse shell, and I can type in who am I, for example, user, and let's see if we can obtain a bash session. There we are, and we can sort of perform some system enumeration. So we've successfully gained access to the Apache Tomcat web server that was hosting a vulnerable web application, or rather a web application. And in this case, Apache Tomcat was configured to utilize a vulnerable version of Log4j that was vulnerable to the Log4Shell vulnerability. We've been able to identify reverse shell. Another really interesting experiment that you can try out is to utilize this form of access to obtain a Meterpreter session on the target system, which should be fairly simple. All you need to do is just configure a listener with Metasploit, a very simple reverse shell listener, and you can then upgrade that session to a Metasploit session. So just to recap, the exploit is fairly simple. We firstly performed a test to ensure that Log4j was enabled, and that it was actually parsing in the actual JNDI LDAP payload that connected to our simple netcat listener that we got a connection on. And then we went ahead to set up the LDAP referral server and specified that we want all requests to be forwarded to the web server that we have set up to host the malicious Java exploit. We then compiled the Java exploit and into a class, and we were then serving it on a simple web server on port 8080. We set up the netcat listener to receive the connection once the class is instantiated. And we then made a request with curl. And in this particular case, we targeted the login form as the input or as the point of input. And in this particular case, the login requests were being logged by Log4j. So that is how to exploit the Log4Shell vulnerability. I've gone into this in much more detail within the scenario mission. If you have any issues, you can always refer back to this. The exploit should work 100% of the time. With that being said, the final stage for you is to take a look at the questions that will verify your understanding of the vulnerability and the actual exploitation.
Thank you very much for tuning in for this episode of CVEs Unmasked. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave us a like and share this video on social media. Furthermore, don't forget to subscribe to the Cyber Rangers YouTube channel for more comprehensive cybersecurity training
powered by CyberRanges. With that being said, thank you very much for watching, and we will be seeing you in the next video. Till then, stay safe.